Hey, it's Mr. Nobody with another book review. I'm going to do two books today, both big, heavy tomes, very thick, very serious. Lots of information in them. I'm going to do this one first. The Great Leveler. I just read this one because I was curious. Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. This is a massive book with enormous amounts of charts and detail, and it literally covers something like 20,000 years of history. It is a truly serious book, and it is just on the question of inequality and what produces it and where does it come from. And if you want me to save you an enormous amount of trouble, the answer is inequality is a human universal. It is a product of human creativity. As long as human creativity exists, inequality exists. As long as individuality exists, inequality exists. So the only ways to eliminate it are to eliminate individuality. And then the interesting questions that he asks in here, looking back at 20,000 years of history, is what are the things that make cultures more or less equal? And I can try to answer that quickly. The things that make societies less equal are stability, productivity, and creativity, because the more that your existing conditions are equalized, the more stable they are, the more it actually allows the enormous differentials between creativity and productivity to be realized and to accrue. And so highly successful cultures inevitably develop inequality. And then he talks about, well, what are the things you can do to mitigate that? And this is not a prescriptive book. It's just looking at the history. It's just looking at the data. He's not telling you what you should do. He's just telling you what has happened in different cultures. And so he talks about that and what different cultures have done and how well it's worked. There's some fascinating bits of history in here. I found China particularly interesting. Because I feel like it helped me understand China of today far better, and how much the pattern of how China works right now today is something that actually hasn't changed. Changed to communism, China is still in many ways very similar to how it was 1,000 years ago. It has particular cycles, it has particular character, and it just goes through these cycles, and it's been through them many times before, and it's still in them. What are the things that bring equality? It turns out only nothingness can really be equalized. Only lack of individuals and lack of productivity can actually be perfectly equalized. The only thing you can share perfectly equally is nothing. So the great equalizers are war, famine, disease, pestilence. Like, these are the things that create inequality. It's the whole thing collapses and drops everything back down here. You destabilize the field, and everyone falls back down to some more level. But then as soon as things become stable and more equal, human variation, individuals, and differences in creativity and productivity start producing inequality of outcomes again, because that's humanity. That's what we are. That's the world that we are in also. So it's an interesting book. It could be a very depressing book, but it's knowledge that's worth having. So I feel like just getting the gist of this book is probably worth it, even just reading the first chapter. So if you have a chance, the first picture in the book is the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and that's the Great Leveler. The Great Leveler is destruction, and the Great Unleveler is creativity and realization of the individual. That's a hard thing to realize. That is a problem. And he realizes that it is a problem. And it is a problem that he says culture has been having to deal with. All cultures across the world have been having to deal with and struggle with on many different levels throughout all of human existence. It is a genuine problem, and it is also a genuine problem that, like I said, the great leveler is destruction, and the great producer of inequality is creativity and productivity and stability. That's a problem. And then also, but then that creating that inequality can cause some people to flip the board. And he has a wonderful history of why something like the 7 out of 10 of the most destructive wars in history have all been in China. And it's because they had the same situation happen again. One group kind of gets in the position of stability, and they grow and they start doing well. And then another group destroys that, and it all falls apart, and that group goes down, and then things stabilize, and then they grow, and then it flips again. And it's just this back and forth, because as differences arise, one of the instincts, particularly in young men, is to flip the board and restart everyone at zero. Because if you're a certain sort of person, you're actually most advantaged by chaos than stability. And chaos puts everyone at a certain level. It allows ambitious and bold, and also in some cases violent and opportunistic people types who are more willing to sacrifice stability and more of some of those values of consciousness to basically reset the board in a way that is favorable for them and gives them a fresh start. And that just seems to be an instinct. And so it raises the question, how do we manage it? If you want to dig really deep into that book, you could, but most people will have a hard time wading through 20,000 years of history and enormous amounts of data. But it is a very interesting book. I also appreciated, too, little human touches you see, stories even about burials, because you can see this arising even in burials from tens of thousands of years ago, the same pattern. But it's also wonderful because you see people. You see that we've always been people. You see a daughter, a young daughter who is just a child who is buried with, these particular grave goods, and they've actually put in the work and realized, to actually make this particular necklace that was placed on this child would have taken hundreds and hundreds of hours of labor, in some cases thousands of hours of labor. And so you see how much the loss of that daughter meant to those parents so long ago. They didn't have a book they could leave behind about her. They didn't have some great thing they could do to communicate that, to the whole world. So they did what they could. They showed her preciousness. They respected her body. They buried her with these things and these precious mementos of the life they had together. Some of them of an enormous value, incredible value, especially for people from, like I said, 15,000 years ago who did not have enormous amounts of wealth. It just shows how much they meant to each other. So I did like the humanizing aspects of that too. You see how similar we are to the people of the past. Same thing, like I said, seeing the continuity of things like China. You're just like, we're people. We're these sorts of people. We've always been these sorts of people. These are the struggles we're having. They're not new. We've always been struggling with it. We're all trying different things. We're all using different ways to try and deal with it. What can we learn from looking back on it and understanding it? So I'll move on from that book. I decided to class this book with it too, The Blank Slate. Plenty of people have reviewed this book. It's a good book. I have a lot of disagreements with Steven Pinker, actually. He's someone who I like and who annoys me too. In some ways he annoys me because I feel like he's someone I'd find very interesting and someone I'd really like to talk with and someone who I'd have a lot of agreement with. And then there's some things where it's like, ooh, so close, but I just think you're really wrong about this point, and you're so close to being really brilliant, but I'm not quite on board with that. Now this is, if you had to pick a Steven Pinker book, I would probably read this one because it's relevant. The Modern Denial of Human Nature. And if this book is anything, this is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, so it's not like he needs my review of it. But it's just saying the blank slate theory is just constructionist bullcrap. That's the easiest way I can summarize it. He's just saying humans aren't just anything. Now, this book sort of relates to A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, which I've talked about before. That's this book over here. This book, if you wanted to say what is one of the problems with the sort of unconstrained vision that's talked about in here, which is basically we can make the world anything we want, we can make humanity anything we can want. This would be Steven Pinker's more scientific answer to that rather than philosophical answer, and just saying, no, we can't. We are a particular thing. The world is a particular thing. That doesn't mean we don't have enormous freedom, but there are certain things that you just have to work with because we actually are something. We're not just nothing. And this is a very good subject to explore and a good subject to learn about. I would say even as a parent, it's an interesting book to explore because, as a parent, of course, what could you care about more than influencing your child? And what I'd say is he paints a complex picture. I think Thomas Sowell paints an even more complex picture because he's someone who's very good at saying, which is it? Is it this or this? And he'd say, well, actually, clearly the data shows it's something of both. You can't ignore either. You are a particular person. Some of that is determined by your genetics. Some of that is determined by your circumstances. An enormous amount of key things actually comes down to choices and individuality, things that can't be predicted. People do go differently. There's twin studies, and yes, twins often have a lot of similarities, but you know what? It doesn't predict everything. Steven Pinker's point is just to really defeat the argument that there's nothing, that everything is just constructed, everything is arbitrary, everything is a blank slate. He doesn't need to make the point everything is determined, and that's not his goal. He's just trying to make the point that everything is not arbitrary, everything is not blank, everything is not constructed, and it's actually shouldn't really be that hard to make a point. It shouldn't be hard to convince people of that. It's so obvious, it's sort of sad that he has to fight to make the point, but you repeat something enough, people keep repeating it, and it just becomes what people believe, even against their own good sense. So I would take this book with a grain of salt. There's a lot to be said, because the question is, well, once you've defeated the blank slate theory, what is the reality? Where do things fall in between? How much? And all of that is still up for debate. And so Pinker has his own perspective on that. Some other people would come at it from a slightly different perspective, and you need to leave your mind open for that. But as far as the central thesis goes of disproving this blank slateism, this sort of Rousseauian vision, it's excellent. And one of the best parts that summarizes it is from near the end, The Voice of the Species. So I'm going to just read this section to you, just so you kind of get the taste. I mean, to some degree, this just is what the book actually has to say. The blank slate was an attractive vision. It promised to make racism, sexism, and class prejudice factually untenable. It appeared to be a bulwark against the kind of thinking that led to ethnic genocide. It aimed to prevent people from slipping into premature fatalism about preventable social ills, put a spotlight on the treatment of children, indigenous peoples, and the underclass. The blank slate thus became part of a secular faith and appeared to constitute the common decency of our age. But the blank slate had and has a dark side. The vacuum that it posited in human nature was eagerly filled by totalitarian regimes, and it did nothing to prevent their genocides. And unfortunately, it actually ended up producing the largest genocides. So it's a case of, and this is me diverging from what he says, it's a beautiful idea that ended up actually being even worse and even more destructive in terms of human lives and the human mind and human happiness and human psychology than the things it was meant to cure. Anyway, I continue. It perverts education, child rearing, and the arts into forms of social engineering. It torments mothers who work outside the home and parents whose children did not turn out as they would have liked. It threatens to outlaw biomedical research that could alleviate human suffering. Its corollary, the noble savage, invites contempt for the principles of democracy and a government of laws and not of men. It blinds us to our cognitive and moral shortcomings. And in matters of policy, it has elevated sappy dogmas above the search for workable solutions. The blank slate is not some ideal we should all hope and pray is true. No, it is an anti life, anti human theoretical abstraction that denies our common humanity, our inherent interests, and our individual preferences. Though it has pretensions of celebrating our potential, it does the opposite because our potential comes from the combinatory interplay of wonderfully complex faculties, not from the passive blankness of an empty tablet. And so he does put it in the context of a vision, much the way Thomas Sowell does, and said this is a beautiful vision. It sounds wonderful. Unfortunately, as also people like Thomas Sowell have pointed out, as also people like Jordan Peterson have pointed out, instead of allowing the flowering of humanity by refusing to admit its existence or the deep truths about it, it ultimately is anti-human, anti-life, and seeks to destroy us and devaluate us, eradicate us, humiliate us, and that is why you see the terrible consequences that flow out of it. And as much as people are shocked, they're like, well, how can such a beautiful idea result in these terrible consequences? Something must have gone completely wrong along the way, and someone like Steve Pinker or Thomas Sowell or Jordan Peterson would say, well, it was a beautiful idea, but it just wasn't true. And that's why. It's just that straightforward. So great book to look at, great book to pick through. Very good if you want to combine it with something like A Conflict of Visions, if you want to combine it with something like Jordan Peterson, if you want to combine it with the understanding particularly of totalitarian regimes. Also relevant in the context of various people who have talked about ideologies as having become a kind of religious vision. And the best person to learn about that would be, in my opinion, Thomas Sowell. But you can get plenty of that from people like Jordan Peterson, and of course, lots of other people have talked about it. These same ideas also underlie the sort of arguments that people like John McWhorter have talked about in his book. They sit at the back. They sit at the back as theoretical assumptions about human nature. And the problem is that these most basic fundamental assumptions about human nature are wrong, and that is what causes this vast castle that's built on it to end up falling on top of everyone. So if you want to explore some of just the data that attacks that most basic assumption about human nature, so you can understand why it is this beautiful vision that sounds so good. Even something like anti-racism, it sounds so good. Why does it end up falling on top of people and end up not looking the way that we expected it to come out? Why does it betray us, as John McWhorter would say? And the argument, which you get from Steven Pinker and others in this case, is just, well, because at the most basic level of assumptions about human nature that undergird these ideologies, they're just radically, radically wrong. We are a species. We have a particular character. We really do have commonalities. And actually recognizing them is an important step to uniting us and to increasing in wisdom and understanding. And although they may frighten us, having an identity may frighten us, running away from it isn't going to solve our problems. It's only going to make them worse, because then we will operate in ignorance. And so that's all I have to say for today. Thanks.